The wind whispered through the pines as Katherine Mitchell's lungs burned with each desperate breath. Her skirts tangled around her ankles as she fled deeper into the woods. The 5 men pursuing her crashed through the underbrush behind her, their voices carrying promises of violence that chilled her more than the autumn air of 1878. She had been running for what felt like hours, though the sun had barely moved in the sky, when she stumbled into a small clearing and saw him, a tall figure on horseback, his features shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Please," Katherine gasped, her voice barely audible as she staggered forward. The man's head snapped toward her, his hand instantly moving to the revolver at his hip. The sounds of her pursuers grew louder, branches snapping, voices calling. The stranger assessed the situation with a single glance, taking in Katherine's torn dress, the fear in her eyes, and the approaching danger. "Get behind me and stay there," the cowboy said, his voice low and steady as he dismounted in one fluid motion. He positioned himself between Katherine and the direction of the voices, his broad shoulders forming a protective barrier. Katherine didn't hesitate. She scrambled behind him, her trembling hands clutching at the back of his worn leather vest as 5 men burst into the clearing, their expressions transforming from predatory excitement to wary calculation as they took in the stranger. The leader of the group, a burly man with a pockmarked face, stepped forward. "This ain't your business, mister. The woman's ours." "I believe the lady disagrees," the cowboy replied, his stance casual but his right hand hovering near his holster. "And that makes it my business." Katherine peered around the cowboy's shoulder, watching as the 5 men spread out in a loose semicircle. She felt his muscles tense beneath her fingers. "Name's Roy Hawkins," the cowboy said, loud enough for all to hear. "I'm riding with the marshal's office out of Hays City. Now, I don't know what's going on here, but I suggest you fellows turn around and head back where you came from." The leader spat on the ground. "You're lying. I know every deputy in 3 counties. Roy's shoulders lifted in a slight shrug. "Started last week. But if you want to test whether I can use this," he tapped his revolver, "you're welcome to try." Katherine held her breath as the standoff stretched. The men exchanged glances, weighing their options. Finally, the leader stepped back. "This ain't over," he growled. "That woman's got something that belongs to us. We'll be seeing her again." "I wouldn't recommend it," Roy replied evenly. The men backed away slowly, disappearing into the trees. Roy remained motionless until the sound of their retreat had faded completely. Only then did he turn to face Katherine, who realized she was still clutching his vest and quickly released it, stepping back on unsteady legs. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They would have—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Roy's face softened as he took in her disheveled appearance. He was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 30, with dark hair visible beneath his hat and eyes the color of a summer sky. A thin scar ran along his jawline, but it did nothing to diminish his handsome features. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, his gaze scanning her for injuries. "No, just frightened, and it's Miss Katherine Mitchell." She attempted to straighten her dress, suddenly conscious of how she must appear. "Miss Mitchell," Roy acknowledged with a slight nod. "Those men, they said you took something from them." Katherine's hand instinctively went to the small pouch hidden in the pocket of her skirt. "They're thieves and murderers," she said firmly. "They killed my father 3 days ago and burned our homestead. I took only what was rightfully mine." Roy studied her face, seeming to weigh the truth of her words. Whatever he saw there appeared to satisfy him. "I wasn't entirely honest with those men," he admitted. "I'm not with any marshal's office. I'm just passing through on my way to Colorado Territory." Katherine's heart sank. "So you can't help me get to the law?" "I didn't say that," Roy replied. Hayes City isn't far. I can escort you there. You can speak to the real law and tell your story." "Those men won't give up," Katherine said, glancing nervously at the woods. "They'll follow us." "Probably," Roy agreed, untethering his horse. The chestnut gelding nickered softly as Roy checked the cinch on his saddle. "But they'll have a harder time catching us if we're riding." "Can you manage?" Katherine nodded. She had grown up on a farm and had been riding since childhood. Roy mounted first, then extended a hand to help her up behind him. She hesitated only briefly before taking it, allowing him to pull her onto the horse. "Hold on tight," he instructed as she settled behind him, her arms tentatively circling his waist. "We'll ride until nightfall, then make camp somewhere defendable." As the horse moved forward, Katherine found herself pressed against Roy's back, the solid warmth of him a stark contrast to the fear that had been her only companion for days. She didn't know this man, didn't know if she could truly trust him, but in this moment, he was her only hope. "What's in Colorado?" she asked as they picked their way through the trees, trying to distract herself from both the persistent fear and the uncomfortable awareness of their proximity. "A fresh start," Roy replied after a moment. "Same as a lot of folks heading west these days, running from something." The question slipped out before she could stop it. Roy was silent for so long that Katherine thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "Maybe running toward something instead." They rode in silence after that, the rhythm of the horse's gait and the fading adrenaline lulling Katherine into a state of exhausted semi-consciousness. She found herself leaning more heavily against Roy, her cheek pressed against his shoulder as the woods gradually thinned and gave way to rolling prairie. The sun was low on the horizon when Roy finally reined in the horse near a small stream sheltered by a stand of cottonwoods. "We'll stop here for the night," he said, dismounting and helping Katherine down. Her legs nearly buckled as she hit the ground, stiff from hours of riding. "Those men," she said, scanning their surroundings anxiously. "Could they have followed us?" "It's possible," Roy admitted, "but not likely. We've covered a lot of ground, and I've been taking us on a roundabout path." He unsaddled his horse and saw to the animal's needs before turning his attention to making camp. Katherine watched as he efficiently gathered wood for a small fire, keeping it low and well shielded by rocks to minimize visibility. "Are you hungry?" he asked, rummaging in his saddlebags and producing some jerky and hardtack. Katherine nodded, suddenly aware of the hollow ache in her stomach. She hadn't eaten since the previous day, a handful of berries her only sustenance. Roy handed her a portion of the food, then settled across from her, the small fire between them. The flickering light cast shadows across his face, highlighting the weariness that seemed etched into his features. "Tell me what happened," he said quietly. "With your father and those men." Katherine swallowed hard, the jerky suddenly difficult to chew. She took a sip from the canteen Roy offered, gathering her thoughts. "My father and I had a small farm about 20 miles east of here," she began. "It wasn't much, but it was ours. 3 days ago, those men rode up, said they were looking for work, but I could tell right away they weren't honest men." She twisted her hands in her lap. "Father offered them water for their horses, but nothing more. He could tell too, I think." Roy listened silently, his gaze steady on her face. They seemed to accept it at first, started to leave. Then the one with the pockmarked face, he turned back and said something about having heard that Daniel Mitchell had struck gold in California years back. Father denied it, of course. "We lived simply. If he'd ever had money, it wasn't evident in how we lived." Katherine paused, the memories washing over her with renewed pain. "They didn't believe him. They dragged him into the house, started tearing it apart looking for valuables. I was in the barn when I heard the shot." Her voice broke. "By the time I got to the house, he He was already gone. They were still ransacking the place. "How did you escape?" Roy asked gently. "The back door." They were so focused on finding whatever they thought we had that they didn't notice me at first. When they did, she shuddered. "I ran into the woods behind our property. I knew those woods better than they did. I managed to hide until nightfall, then circled back." "You went back?" Roy's eyebrows rose in surprise. Katherine nodded. "I had to. I couldn't leave my father unmourned. And I knew what they were looking for." Her hand went to the pouch again. "My father did have something of value, not gold but a deed, to land in Colorado. And this." She pulled out the pouch and carefully extracted a small object wrapped in cloth. Unwrapping it, she revealed a small gold locket. It was my mother's, the only thing of value we truly possessed. Inside is a map to the land. Father always said it would be my inheritance someday. Roy leaned forward, studying the locket but not touching it. "And those men, they must have found out somehow. Maybe they'd been tracking my father for some time. I don't know. What I do know is that they won't stop coming after me as long as they think I have something valuable. The deed might be worth something, depending on where the land is," Roy acknowledged. "But it wouldn't be easy for them to claim it without proper documentation." "It's not just the deed," Katherine said quietly. "There are rumors. My father never confirmed them, but I've heard him talking with old friends. The land supposedly has a vein of silver running through it. That's why he never sold it, even when times were hard." Roy's expression turned thoughtful. "That would certainly explain their persistence." He added another small branch to the fire. "Get some rest, Miss Mitchell. I'll take first watch. We'll head for Hays City at first light." Katherine wanted to protest that she should take a turn at watch as well, but exhaustion was rapidly overtaking her. She settled onto the bedroll Roy had laid out for her, her body aching from the day's ordeal. "Mr. Hawkins," she murmured, already half asleep, "thank you for saving my life." If Roy responded, Katherine didn't hear it as sleep claimed her, deep and dreamless. She awoke to the gentle touch of a hand on her shoulder and the soft glow of pre-dawn light filtering through the trees. For a moment, disorientation gripped her, then the events of the previous day came rushing back. "We should get moving," Roy said, already packed and ready. His eyes were shadowed with fatigue, and Katherine realized he must have kept watch all night, letting her sleep. "You didn't wake me for my turn at watch," she observed, rising stiffly. Roy shrugged. "You needed the rest more than I needed sleep." They ate a quick breakfast of the remaining jerky, then mounted up and continued their journey. The day was clear but cool, the October sun providing light but little warmth as they rode across the open prairie. Katherine found herself more alert today, able to appreciate the beauty of the landscape, the vast expanse of grassland stretching to the horizon, interrupted occasionally by stands of trees marking the presence of water. "Have you been to Hays City before?" Roy asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Once, when I was younger," Katherine replied. "Father would go a few times a year for supplies, but he usually left me with our neighbors, the Wilsons." A pang of sadness hit her as she thought of the elderly couple who had been like grandparents to her. "I should try to get word to them about what happened." "We can arrange that once we reach town," Roy assured her. "It's grown a lot in recent years. The railroads brought more people, more business. And you seem familiar with it." Roy was silent for a moment. "I passed through a few years back, stayed for a time." There was something in his tone that suggested there was more to the story, but Katherine didn't press. They all had their secrets, their pasts they preferred not to discuss with strangers. Around midday they crested a gentle rise, and Katherine saw it in the distance, the collection of buildings that marked Hays City. Relief washed over her. Civilization. Law. Safety. It was still several miles away, but the sight alone was enough to lift her spirits. "We'll be there before sundown," Roy said, following her gaze. "The sheriff in Hayes is a good man, from what I remember. He'll listen to your story." Katherine nodded, grateful once again for Roy's intervention in the woods. Without him, she might still be running, or worse. They were within a mile of the town when Roy suddenly tensed, pulling the horse to a stop. Katherine followed his gaze and felt her heart sink. Ahead of them, just where the trail entered a narrow pass between two low hills, were three riders. "It's them," she whispered, recognizing the pockmarked face of the leader even at this distance. "How did they get ahead of us?" "They must have circled around," Roy muttered, scanning their surroundings. "There's no way around without being seen." "What do we do?" Katherine's arms tightened around Roy's waist instinctively. Roy was silent for a moment, considering their options. Then, to Katherine's surprise, he urged the horse forward, directly toward the waiting men. "Mr. Hawkins," she hissed. "What are you doing?" "Trust me," he said quietly. "And remember, Hayes City is just beyond those hills. If something happens, run for it. Don't look back." Katherine wanted to argue, to insist they find another way, but they were already drawing too close to the men. She could see their faces clearly now, the leader with his pockmarked complexion, a thin man with a scraggly beard, and a third man whose most notable feature was a missing ear. "Well, well," the leader called out as Roy brought the horse to a stop several yards away. "Told you we'd be seeing you again, Miss Mitchell." "She's under my protection," Roy said calmly, "and we're heading into Hayes City to speak with the sheriff about the murder of her father." The three men exchanged glances, then the leader laughed. "That's so. And what evidence do you have of any crime? It'll be your word against ours." "3 against 2, the thin man added with a sneer. "Where are your other 2 friends?" Roy asked, his tone conversational despite the tension evident in his posture. "Around," the leader said vaguely. "Now, here's how this is going to work. The girl's going to hand over what's ours, and maybe we'll let you both ride away." "It's not yours," Katherine said, finding her voice despite her fear. "You killed my father for it. Your father was a stubborn old fool who could have saved himself if he just cooperated," the man with the missing ear spat. "Don't make the same mistake." Roy's hand moved subtly toward his gun. "I suggest you boys step aside and let us pass. The law in Hayes City will sort this out." The leader's face hardened. "Last chance. Give us the deed and the map, or things get ugly." Katherine felt Roy's muscles tense beneath her hands. In one fluid motion, he drew his revolver and fired, the shot striking the ground directly in front of the leader's horse. The animal reared in panic, nearly unseating its rider. "Next one won't miss," Roy warned as the leader struggled to control his mount. "Now move aside." The thin man's hand darted toward his holster, but Roy's gun was already trained on him. "Don't," Roy said simply. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the 3 men backed their horses away from the trail, creating a path. "This isn't over," the leader growled as Roy urged their horse forward. "It could be," Roy replied. "Ride away now and keep riding. There's plenty of places to start fresh where no one asks questions about your past." The men made no response, but Katherine could feel their eyes boring into her back as she and Roy passed between them and continued toward the hills. She expected at any moment to hear hoofbeats behind them, shots fired, but the only sound was the steady rhythm of their own horse's gait. "Why did they let us go?" she whispered when they were beyond earshot. "Too public," Roy replied, not slowing their pace. "We're too close to town. They're not giving up, just changing tactics. You think they'll follow us into Hayes City?" "Maybe not all of them, but they'll have someone watching, waiting for an opportunity." Roy glanced over his shoulder. And they mentioned having 2 more men around. We need to be careful. They crested the hills and Hayes City spread out before them, larger than Katherine remembered. The railroad tracks cut through the southern edge of town, a train visible at the station disgorging passengers and cargo. Streets lined with wooden buildings stretched in a grid pattern, the afternoon sun glinting off the occasional glass window. People moved about on their daily business, unaware of the drama unfolding just outside their town. Roy guided the horse down the slope toward the main street. "We'll go straight to the sheriff's office," he said. "The sooner you're under official protection, the better." Katherine nodded, relief and apprehension warring within her as they entered the town proper. After days of fear and running, the prospect of safety was almost overwhelming. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. As they rode down the main street, Katherine became acutely aware of the stares they were attracting. Her dress was torn and dirty, her hair a tangled mess. Roy didn't look much better, his clothes dust-covered and his face showing the strain of a sleepless night. They reached the sheriff's office, a solid building with barred windows and a sign proclaiming it as the domain of Sheriff Thomas Miller. Roy dismounted first, then helped Katherine down. Her legs trembled beneath her, a combination of physical exhaustion and frayed nerves. "Ready?" Roy asked quietly, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. Katherine took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready." The interior of the sheriff's office was cool and dimly lit compared to the bright afternoon outside. A man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and a neatly trimmed mustache looked up from his desk as they entered. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, his keen eyes taking in their disheveled appearance. "Sheriff Miller," Roy confirmed. When the man nodded, he continued, "My name is Roy Hawkins. This is Miss Katherine Mitchell. She needs to report a murder and ongoing threat to her safety." Sheriff Miller's expression turned serious. "Have a seat, Miss Mitchell," he said, gesturing to a chair near his desk. "Tell me what happened." Katherine sank gratefully into the chair and, for the second time in 24 hours, recounted the events at her farm. The sheriff listened without interruption, making occasional notes. "These men," he said when she had finished, "would you recognize them again?" "Yes," Katherine said firmly. "They're here, in fact, or just outside town. We encountered 3 of them on the trail in." Sheriff Miller's eyebrows rose. "Here, now?" Roy stepped forward. "They were waiting for us about a mile out, 3 of them, though they claimed to have 2 more nearby. They're after a deed to land in Colorado that Miss Mitchell's father owned. They believe it has silver on it." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, considering this information. "Do you have any proof of what happened? Witnesses to the murder?" Katherine's heart sank. "No, just me." "The farm," Roy suggested. "There would be evidence there, her father's body." Sheriff Miller nodded slowly. "I'll send one of my deputies out first thing tomorrow to investigate. In the meantime," he studied Katherine with sympathy, "you'll need a safe place to stay, Miss Mitchell. These men, if they're as determined as you say, won't give up easily." "I was hoping," Katherine began hesitantly, "that you might be able to provide some protection, at least until we can prove what they did." "We?" The sheriff's gaze shifted to Roy. "You're involved in this, Mr. Hawkins." Roy hesitated, his eyes meeting Katherine's briefly. "I intervened when these men were chasing Miss Mitchell through the woods. I couldn't just leave her to face them alone." Something in the sheriff's expression changed, a flicker of recognition perhaps. "Hawkins," he repeated thoughtfully. "Have we met before?" Roy shifted uncomfortably. "I passed through Hayes City a few years back." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "Miss Mitchell, I can offer you a cell for the night. It's not comfortable, but it's the safest place in town." "A cell?" Katherine echoed, dismayed at the thought of spending the night in jail, even for her protection. Or there's the boarding house, Sheriff Miller continued. Mrs. Peterson runs a respectable establishment. I could post a deputy outside your door. The boarding house, Katherine said quickly, relieved at the alternative. The sheriff nodded. As for you, Mr. Hawkins, I appreciate you bringing Miss Mitchell safely to town. If you'd like to leave a statement about what you witnessed, I'll be staying, Roy interrupted. To Katherine's surprise, he added, at least until we're certain Miss Mitchell is safe and these men are brought to justice. Sheriff Miller's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. Very well. I'll arrange for Miss Mitchell at the boarding house and assign a deputy. In the meantime, I suggest you both get cleaned up and get some rest. You look like you could use it. As they left the sheriff's office, Katherine glanced at Roy. You don't have to stay, she said quietly. You've already done more than enough. Roy's expression was unreadable in the late afternoon light. I said I'd help you get to safety. You're not safe yet, he hesitated. Besides, I've got nowhere pressing to be. Katherine wanted to ask more, to understand why this stranger was willing to put himself at risk for her, but they were interrupted by the return of Sheriff Miller, who had stepped out briefly to make arrangements. Mrs. Peterson has a room available, he informed Katherine. My deputy, Jim Forrester, will escort you there and keep watch through the night. As for you, Mr. Hawkins, the Drover's Inn down the street has beds for rent. Katherine thanked the sheriff, then turned to Roy. Will I see you tomorrow? Count on it, he replied with a slight smile. Get some rest, Miss Mitchell. Things will look better in the morning. As she followed Deputy Forrester toward the boarding house, Katherine couldn't help but look back at Roy, who stood watching her go, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. She still knew almost nothing about him, yet in the space of a day he had become her protector, her ally, and perhaps, she thought with a flutter in her chest, something more. The boarding house run by Mrs. Peterson was a 2-story white clapboard building with green shutters and a wide porch. The interior was immaculately kept, smelling of beeswax and lavender. Mrs. Peterson herself, a plump woman with silver-streaked brown hair pinned in a neat bun, greeted Katherine with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Sheriff Miller explained you're in a bit of trouble, dear, she said, leading Katherine upstairs. Don't you worry. No one gets past my front door without my say-so. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. Katherine, who had expected to spend another night sleeping on the ground, nearly wept at the sight of it. There's hot water for washing up, Mrs. Peterson continued, and I'll have a tray sent up with some supper. You look like you could use a good meal. Thank you, Katherine said sincerely. You're very kind. It's nothing, dear, just neighborly. Now that deputy will be right outside your door all night, so you get some sleep and don't fret. Left alone, Katherine took full advantage of the hot water, scrubbing away days of dirt and fear. By the time a tray arrived with a hearty stew, fresh bread, and apple pie, she was feeling more human than she had since her father's murder. As she ate by the window, she watched the street below gradually empty as businesses closed for the night. The deputy sat on a chair outside her door, his occasional movements audible through the thin walls. For the first time in days, Katherine felt safe enough to truly relax. Her thoughts turned to Roy Hawkins. Who was he, really? A drifter with a gun and a conscience. There was more to him than that, she was certain. The way Sheriff Miller had looked at him suggested a history, perhaps not an entirely positive one. Yet he had risked his life for her without hesitation, and she couldn't deny the flutter in her stomach when he smiled at her. The night passed peacefully, and Katherine slept better than she had in days, though her dreams were troubled by fleeting images of her father and the sound of gunfire. She awoke to sunlight streaming through the window and the distant sounds of the town coming to life. After dressing in the clean clothes Mrs. Peterson had thoughtfully provided, simple but well-made. If a bit large, Katherine made her way downstairs to find Roy Hawkins sitting in the parlor, engaged in conversation with the landlady. He stood when he saw her, and Katherine was struck by how different he looked after a night's rest and, presumably, his own chance to clean up. His dark hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, revealing strong features that the trail dust had partly obscured. "Good morning, Miss Mitchell," he said, his blue eyes warming as they met hers. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I expected," Katherine admitted. "Has there been any news? The sheriff sent Deputy Forrester and another man out to your farm at first light," Roy replied. "They should be back by midday with whatever evidence they find." Mrs. Peterson bustled in with a tray of coffee and biscuits. "Sit and eat, dear," she instructed Katherine. "No sense facing the day on an empty stomach." As they ate, Roy filled her in on what he'd learned that morning. "Sheriff Miller has men watching the town's entrances. No sign of those three who confronted us yesterday, but that doesn't mean they've given up." "What do we do now?" Katherine asked, the reality of her situation settling back upon her. Even if the sheriff's men found evidence of her father's murder, bringing his killers to justice would be a long process. And what would she do afterward? The farm, her home for all her 22 years, was now tainted by tragedy. "We wait," Roy said simply. "Let the law do its work. In the meantime, you stay close to the boarding house with Deputy Forrester keeping watch." "And you?" Katherine asked, meeting his gaze. "What will you do?" Something flickered in Roy's eyes, determination, perhaps, or a decision made. "I'll be around," he said. "I have some business in town to attend to, but I'll check on you regularly." Katherine wanted to ask what business could possibly keep him in Hays City when he'd been bound for Colorado, but she was interrupted by Mrs. Peterson returning with more coffee. "Sheriff Miller is here to see you both," the landlady announced, showing the lawmen into the parlor. Sheriff Miller nodded to them, declining Mrs. Peterson's offer of coffee. "We've got a situation," he said without preamble. "A telegram came in this morning from the sheriff in Ellsworth. Those men you described, Miss Mitchell, they're wanted there for robbery and assault. They've been operating in this area for several months." Relief washed over Katherine. "So you believe me about what they did to my father?" "I'm inclined to, yes," Sheriff Miller confirmed. "Forrester hasn't returned yet, but this certainly supports your account." His expression turned grave. "However, there's a complication. The leader of this gang, a man named Garrett Sloan, was spotted in town this morning." Katherine felt the blood drain from her face. "Here, in Hays City." "At the saloon on 2nd Street, the sheriff confirmed. "He was asking questions about a woman matching your description. My deputy tried to bring him in for questioning, but he slipped away." "So he knows she's here," Roy said, his voice tight with concern. "And he knows she's being protected." Sheriff Miller nodded. "It changes things. I've only got 3 deputies, and I can't keep one assigned to Miss Mitchell indefinitely. Plus, if these men are desperate enough, they might not care about the law standing in their way." "What are you suggesting?" Roy asked, his eyes narrowing. The sheriff sighed. "I'm suggesting that Hays City might not be the safest place for Miss Mitchell right now, at least not until we can round up Sloan and his gang." "But where would I go?" Katherine asked, dismay washing over her. The brief sense of safety she had felt was evaporating rapidly. "That land deed you mentioned," Sheriff Miller said. "The one in Colorado. Do you know exactly where the property is?" Katherine nodded hesitantly. "Denver, or just outside it, according to the map in my mother's locket." "The train to Denver leaves tomorrow morning," the sheriff said. "My suggestion would be for you to be on it. Once you're in Colorado territory, you'd be beyond Sloan's usual hunting grounds, And if the land really does have value, you could potentially start fresh there. Catherine's mind reeled at the suggestion. Leave for Colorado, alone. The prospect was terrifying. She can't travel alone, Roy said suddenly, voicing her thoughts. Not with Sloan and his men potentially following. They could easily board the same train. I'm aware of that, Sheriff Miller replied, giving Roy an appraising look. Which is why I'm wondering if you might consider continuing as Miss Mitchell's protector for a bit longer, Mr. Hawkins. You said you were headed to Colorado anyway. Katherine looked at Roy in surprise. She hadn't expected the sheriff to suggest such an arrangement. Roy was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. I'll do it, he said finally, on one condition. Which is? The sheriff asked. You wire ahead to the authorities in Denver, explain the situation. I don't want to arrive with Miss Mitchell only to find ourselves facing more questions about who's pursuing whom. Sheriff Miller nodded. Reasonable enough. I'll send the telegram today. He turned to Katherine. Miss Mitchell, I understand this isn't ideal. In a perfect world, we'd apprehend these men immediately and you could take your time deciding your next steps, but with Sloan in town and clearly looking for you. I understand, Katherine said quietly, and I appreciate your honesty, Sheriff. She glanced at Roy, finding reassurance in his steady gaze. If Mr. Hawkins is willing to accompany me, then I believe heading to Colorado is the wisest course. It's settled then, Sheriff Miller said, rising. I'll arrange for your tickets and send that telegram. In the meantime, you both stay here where it's safe. Mrs. Peterson, he called to the landlady, who had been hovering discreetly in the doorway, I'm deputizing you to make sure these two don't leave this house until I return. Mrs. Peterson drew herself up proudly. You can count on me, Sheriff. After the sheriff had gone, a silence fell between Katherine and Roy. There was so much unsaid, so many questions she wanted to ask him, but she hardly knew where to begin. You don't have to do this, she said finally. Escort me to Colorado, I mean. You've already risked enough on my behalf. Roy's expression softened. I told you before I was headed that way regardless. He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. Besides, I've developed a certain interest in seeing this through, making sure you get what's rightfully yours. Why? Katherine asked, the directness of her question surprising even herself. Why help a stranger this way? Roy looked away, his gaze fixing on some distant point beyond the window. Maybe because I know what it's like to lose everything, to have to start over. He met her eyes again. And maybe because not everyone gets that chance. A fresh start, I mean. There was a story there, Katherine realized. A past that had shaped the man sitting across from her, that had perhaps driven him west toward Colorado just as circumstances were now driving her. But before she could ask more, Mrs. Peterson bustled back in, effectively ending their private conversation. The day passed slowly, the confines of the boarding house becoming increasingly restrictive as hours ticked by. Deputy Forrester returned mid-afternoon with confirmation that they had found Daniel Mitchell's body at the farm, buried in a shallow grave near the barn. It was the verification Katherine had both dreaded and needed proof of her father's murder that would strengthen the case against Sloan and his men. By evening, Sheriff Miller returned with train tickets for the morning departure, and news that he had sent the telegram to Denver as promised. He also brought a small revolver, which he presented to Katherine. It's not much, he said as she examined the weapon, but it's reliable and easy to use. I hope you won't need it, but given the circumstances. I know how to shoot, Katherine assured him, thinking of the hours her father had spent teaching her to handle firearms on the farm. Thank you. As night fell, new sleeping arrangements were made. Roy would take a room down the hall from Katherine's, with Deputy Forrester maintaining his watch in the hallway between them. The house was secured, every window checked, every door locked. Despite the precautions, Katherine found sleep elusive that night. Tomorrow she would board a train for Denver, leaving behind everything she had ever known: her home, her father's grave, the life she had expected to lead. She was venturing into the unknown with a man who was still largely a stranger to her, despite the inexplicable trust she felt toward him. When dawn broke, Katherine was already awake and dressed in the new traveling outfit. Mrs. Peterson had helped her acquire the previous day a practical dark blue skirt and jacket with a white blouse. Her few possessions, including her father's deed and her mother's locket, were safely stowed in a small carpet bag Mrs. Peterson had insisted she take. Roy was waiting in the parlor, his own belongings packed and ready. He looked up as she entered, his eyes taking in her appearance with evident appreciation. "You look ready for a new beginning," he said with a small smile. "I don't feel ready," Katherine admitted, "but I suppose few of us ever do when life forces a change upon us." Sheriff Miller arrived to escort them to the station, bringing news that there had been no further sightings of Sloan or his men since the previous day. "Which could mean they've moved on," the sheriff said as they walked toward the station, Deputy Forrester following a few paces behind. "Or it could mean they're lying low, waiting for an opportunity." "We'll be careful," Roy assured him, his hand never straying far from his holster. His eyes constantly scanned their surroundings as they made their way through the awakening town. The train station was bustling with activity: passengers boarding, porters loading luggage, vendors selling newspapers and refreshments. Sheriff Miller led them directly to the train, bypassing the usual wait on the platform. "I've spoken to the conductor," he explained. "You'll be able to board immediately and stay in your compartment until departure." As they reached the train, the sheriff shook Roy's hand. "Take care of her, Hawkins, and—" He hesitated, lowering his voice. "Consider this a chance to set things right, for both of you." Roy nodded, a silent understanding passing between the two men that Katherine couldn't quite decipher. Then the sheriff turned to her. "Miss Mitchell, I'm sorry about your father. He was, by all accounts, a good man. I hope you find some peace in Colorado." "Thank you for everything, Sheriff," Katherine said sincerely. "I won't forget your kindness." With a final nod, Sheriff Miller stepped back, allowing Roy to help Katherine board the train. Their compartment was small but private, with two bench seats facing each other and a window overlooking the platform. Katherine settled by the window, watching as the station came to life around them. "Look sharp," Roy said suddenly, his voice low. Katherine followed his gaze and felt her heart skip a beat. There, at the far end of the platform, partially obscured by a stack of crates, was a familiar figure: the thin man with the scraggly beard who had been with Sloan. "He's watching the train," Roy observed, "but I don't see the others." "You think they know we're on board?" Katherine asked, shrinking back from the window. "Possibly. Or they're just covering their bases." Roy's hand went to his gun. "Stay here. I'm going to alert the conductor." Before Katherine could protest, he was gone, sliding the compartment door closed behind him. She sat frozen, her eyes fixed on the thin man, who was now moving slowly along the platform, peering into windows. Her hand went to the small revolver concealed in her jacket pocket, the weight of it both reassuring and terrifying. Roy returned moments later with a burly conductor in tow. "Madam," the conductor said with a nod to Katherine, "Mr. Hawkins here has explained your situation. Rest assured, we take the safety of our passengers very seriously. I've alerted my staff to be on the lookout for troublemakers and will be departing momentarily." True to his word, within minutes a whistle blew and the train lurched into motion. Katherine watched the platform slide away, the thin man growing smaller in the distance. For a moment she thought they had escaped, but then she saw him running alongside the slowly accelerating train. "He's trying to board," she gasped, pointing. Roy cursed under his breath, moving to the door. "Stay here," he ordered. "Lock this behind me." "Roy, no." Katherine caught his arm. "It's too dangerous." He paused, the use of his first name seeming to surprise him. "I'll be careful," he promised, "but I need to make sure he doesn't get on this train." With that, he was gone again. Katherine locked the door as instructed, then returned to the window, watching in horror as the thin man managed to grasp a handrail on the last car and pull himself aboard. The train was picking up speed now, the station falling away behind them. Minutes passed with excruciating slowness. Katherine strained to hear any sounds of confrontation over the rhythmic clacking of the wheels on the tracks, her imagination conjuring terrible scenarios. When a knock finally came at the door, she jumped. "Katherine," Roy's voice called. "It's me." She unlocked the door with trembling hands to find Roy standing there, his shirt torn at the shoulder but otherwise unharmed. "What happened?" she demanded as he entered, locking the door again behind him. "Our friend won't be bothering us anymore," Roy said grimly, settling onto the bench across from her. "He made the mistake of pulling a knife. The conductor and I convinced him the best option was to jump back off the train." "Is he—" Katherine couldn't finish the question. "Dead?" "No. We weren't moving that fast yet. Injured, probably." Roy's expression was hard to read. "But it means Sloane knows we're on this train and where we're headed." Katherine's momentary relief faded. "So it's not over." "No," Roy agreed, "but we have some advantages now. We're moving, for one thing. And Denver's a big city, much larger than Hayes City. It'll be easier to disappear there, to blend in while we sort out your land claim." The way he said "we" sent a small thrill through Katherine, despite the circumstances. It suggested a partnership, a shared future beyond simply escorting her to safety. "Tell me about yourself, Roy," she said suddenly, wanting to know more about this man who had become so central to her life in such a short time. "You know my story, but I know almost nothing about you." Roy looked surprised by the question, then thoughtful. He gazed out the window at the passing landscape for a long moment before speaking. "I grew up in Missouri," he began, his voice taking on a distant quality. "My father was a blacksmith, taught me the trade from the time I could lift a hammer. My mother died when I was young, but we got by, the two of us." Katherine listened, watching the play of emotions across his face as he continued. "When the war came, I was 18, old enough to fight. My father didn't want me to go, said it wasn't our quarrel, but I was young and full of ideas about honor and duty." A shadow crossed his face. "I joined the Union Army, spent 3 years fighting in battles that seemed to have no purpose other than to fill graves." "I'm sorry," Katherine said softly, understanding now some of the weariness she had sensed in him. "When I came home, everything had changed. My father had died while I was away. The smithy had been sold to pay his debts. There was nothing left for me there." Roy's gaze returned to Katherine. "So I headed west like countless others. Tried my hand at different things, ranching in Texas for a while, mining in Nevada. None of it stuck. And then," Katherine prompted gently when he fell silent. Roy hesitated, and she could see him deciding how much to tell her. "I fell in with the wrong people for a time," he admitted. "Did things I'm not proud of, but I've been trying to make amends to find a better path." "Is that what Colorado represents to you? That better path?" "I hope so." Roy's expression lightened slightly. "I have some money saved. Enough to buy a small ranch, maybe, raise horses." He shrugged. "It's a dream anyway." "A good one," Katherine said sincerely. "Everyone deserves a chance at a new beginning." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition of shared hopes despite their different journeys. Katherine felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with fear or anxiety. For a moment, the dangers they faced seemed distant, overshadowed by this connection that was growing between them. The moment was broken by a knock at the door, the conductor checking on them and informing them that lunch would be served in the dining car shortly. "We should eat," Roy said after the conductor had gone. "It's a long journey to Denver, 2 days with stops along the way." Katherine nodded, suddenly aware of her hunger. As they made their way to the dining car, Roy positioned himself slightly ahead of her, his posture alert, eyes scanning each passenger they passed. His protectiveness touched her, even as she hoped it wouldn't be necessary. The dining car was elegant in a way Katherine had never experienced, tables covered in white linen, silver cutlery gleaming in the sunlight that streamed through the large windows. They were seated at a small table by a window, the Kansas landscape rolling past as they studied their menus. "Order whatever you'd like," Roy said when she hesitated over the prices. "My treat." "That's not necessary," Katherine protested. "I have some money." "Consider it my contribution to our partnership," Roy insisted with a small smile. "Besides, who knows when we'll next have the chance for a proper meal?" Relenting, Katherine ordered the roast chicken while Roy chose the beefsteak. As they ate, their conversation turned to lighter topics: books they had read, places they had seen, childhood memories that brought smiles rather than shadows to their eyes. Katherine found herself laughing for the first time since her father's death, the sound surprising her with its genuineness. "You have a beautiful laugh," Roy observed, his eyes warm. "You should use it more often." Katherine felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "I haven't had much cause for laughter recently." "No," Roy agreed soberly, "but you will again. Life has a way of continuing even after the worst happens." Their meal concluded, they returned to their compartment to find that, in their absence, the conductor had arranged for their seats to be converted into sleeping berths for the night journey ahead. The upper and lower berths were separated by a thick curtain, offering at least the illusion of privacy in the small space. "You take the lower berth," Roy said as evening approached and the sky outside darkened. "I'll sleep above." Katherine didn't argue, grateful for his consideration. As night fell and the train continued its westward journey, the rhythmic swaying and the distant sound of the wheels on the tracks lulled her toward sleep. Yet her mind remained active, replaying the events that had brought her to this point and wondering what awaited her in Denver. She thought of the land that was now hers, wondering if the rumors of silver were true and what that might mean for her future. She thought of Roy, sleeping just a few feet away, and the growing feelings she could no longer deny having for him. Was it merely gratitude and the intensity of their shared experience? Or was it something deeper, something that might last beyond this journey? With these thoughts circling in her mind, Katherine finally drifted into sleep, the motion of the train carrying her toward a future she could never have imagined just days ago. The first day of their journey passed without further incident, the train stopping at various towns along the route where passengers disembarked and new ones boarded. Roy remained vigilant at each stop, watching for any sign of Sloan or his remaining men, but saw nothing suspicious. By the second day, Katherine had begun to relax somewhat, allowing herself to enjoy the changing landscape outside their window, as the flat Kansas plains gradually gave way to the rolling terrain of eastern Colorado. The distant outline of mountains began to appear on the horizon, their peaks still snow-capped even in early autumn. "It's beautiful," she murmured, gazing out at the scenery. "I can see why my father held onto the land here, even if he never returned to it." Roy, seated across from her, followed her gaze. "Colorado's a place of opportunity," he agreed. "New beginnings for those willing to work for them." As the train approached Denver in the late afternoon, the conductor came by to inform them they would be arriving within the hour. Katherine felt a flutter of both excitement and anxiety. Soon they would disembark into a city she had never seen, to claim land she had never visited, all while potentially being pursued by men determined to take what was hers. "What's our plan when we arrive?" she asked Roy, who had been studying a map of Denver he'd purchased from a vendor at their last stop. "First, we find lodging for the night," he replied. "Somewhere secure. Tomorrow we visit the land office to verify your deed and officially record your claim. After that—" he looked up, meeting her eyes. "After that, we locate your property and decide what to do with it." The "we" in his statement wasn't lost on Katherine, but she didn't comment on it. Instead, she asked, "And Sloan and his men, what if they followed us?" "Denver's a city of nearly 40,000 people," Roy said. "Much easier to blend in than Hayes City, but we'll still be careful. No unnecessary risks." The train began to slow as it approached Denver's station, the outskirts of the city visible through their window. Katherine gathered her few belongings, including the precious deed and locket, securing them in her carpetbag. "Ready?" Roy asked as the train came to a complete stop, the hiss of steam and the calls of porters filling the air outside. Katherine took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready." Roy insisted on exiting first, scanning the platform before helping Katherine down from the train. The Denver station was bustling with activity, far busier than Hayes City had been, with passengers of all descriptions moving in every direction, porters wheeling carts of luggage, and vendors selling everything from newspapers to hot chestnuts. "This way," Roy said, placing a protective hand at the small of Katherine's back as he guided her through the crowd toward the station exit. His eyes never stopped moving, assessing each face they passed for potential threats. Outside the station, they found a line of carriages for hire. Roy selected one, helping Katherine in before giving the driver the name of a hotel he had heard recommended during their journey. "The Windsor Hotel is supposed to be one of the finest in Denver," he explained as the carriage set off through the streets. "More importantly, it's secure and centrally located." "Can we afford it?" Katherine asked, mindful of their limited resources. "For a night or two," Roy assured her. "Long enough to get our bearings and make our plans." The Denver streets were a revelation to Katherine, who had never been in a city of this size. Buildings of brick and stone rose 3 and 4 stories high, their facades ornate with decorative elements. The streets were busy with carriages, wagons, and pedestrians, the air filled with the sounds of commerce and conversation. The Windsor Hotel lived up to Roy's description, an imposing building of red brick with elaborate stonework and a grand entrance. Inside, the lobby was elegant, with polished marble floors, oak paneling, and crystal chandeliers. Katherine felt distinctly out of place in her simple traveling clothes as Roy arranged for their rooms. 2 adjoining rooms, he requested at the front desk, under the name Hawkins. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles and a supercilious manner, looked from Roy to Katherine with barely concealed disapproval. "Your relationship to the lady, sir." Roy's expression hardened. "My sister," he said flatly, daring the man to challenge him. The clerk's demeanor changed immediately. "Of course, sir. My apologies. We have suitable accommodations on the 2nd floor." Once they were settled in their rooms connected by a door that could be locked from either side, Katherine sank onto the edge of her bed, overwhelmed by the events of the past few days and the luxury that now surrounded her. "This is all happening so quickly," she murmured when Roy knocked and entered through the connecting door. "A week ago, I was helping my father with the harvest. Now he's gone. I'm in a city I've never seen, and everything I knew has changed." Roy's expression softened as he sat beside her on the bed, leaving a respectful distance between them. "I know it's overwhelming," he said gently, "but you're stronger than you realize, Katherine. I've seen it in how you faced everything that's happened." The use of her first name, rare from him, brought a warmth to her cheeks. "It helps to have someone to face it with," she admitted. Their eyes met, and for a moment Katherine thought he might reach for her hand or perhaps even. But then Roy stood abruptly, crossing to the window. "We should rest tonight," he said, his back to her as he gazed out at the darkening city. "Tomorrow will be busy. The land office opens at 9, according to the hotel clerk." Katherine felt a pang of disappointment at the moment lost, but she understood his caution. Their situation was still precarious, their relationship undefined. There would be time for such matters once her claim was secured and the threat from Sloane diminished. "I'll order supper sent up," Roy continued. "It's safer than dining in the restaurant downstairs, where we'd be visible to anyone who might be watching." Katherine agreed, and soon they were sharing a meal in her room, the connecting door left open between their spaces. The food was excellent, far better than anything Katherine had eaten on the farm, but she found her appetite diminished by the tension that lingered between them, unspoken but palpable. "Tell me about your mother," Roy said suddenly, breaking a silence that had stretched too long. "You mentioned the locket was hers." Grateful for the conversation, Katherine reached for the locket she now wore around her neck. "She died when I was 15, she said, opening the small gold oval to reveal a faded map on one side and a tiny portrait on the other. "Influenza. Before that she was everything a mother should be, kind, patient, strong." Roy leaned closer to examine the portrait. "You have her eyes," he observed, "and her smile, I'd wager." "My father always said so," Katherine agreed with a sad smile. "He never really recovered from losing her. I think that's partly why he never returned to Colorado. This land," she touched the map, "he bought it for her, a promise of a new life together that they never got to fulfill." "And now it's yours to fulfill," Roy said quietly. "Yes," Katherine agreed, closing the locket. "Though I hardly know what to do with land in Colorado. I've only ever known farming." "There are many possibilities," Roy said, "depending on where exactly the property is located and what it offers. If there really is silver, then I would have means I've never imagined," Katherine finished. "But I'm not sure wealth alone would make me happy." "What would?" Roy asked, his gaze intent. Katherine considered the question, one she had rarely allowed herself to contemplate. "A home," she said finally. "Not just a house, but a true home, someone to share it with, purpose. Perhaps children someday." She felt herself blushing again at the personal nature of her admission. Roy's expression was unreadable. "Simple things that matter most," he said softly. "I understand that." The moment was interrupted by a knock at the outer door, a hotel staff member collecting their dinner trays. By the time the man had gone, the intimate atmosphere had dissipated, replaced by a more practical mood. "We should turn in," Roy suggested. "Early start tomorrow." Katherine agreed, and they bid each other good night, Roy retreating to his own room and closing the connecting door most of the way, leaving it slightly ajar in case you need anything, as he put it. Alone, Katherine prepared for bed, her mind full of the day's experiences and the man in the next room. She had known Roy Hawkins for only 3 days, yet he had become central to her world, her protector, her guide, and perhaps something more, though neither of them had given voice to the growing attraction between them. As she slipped into the most comfortable bed she had ever encountered, Katherine wondered what tomorrow would bring. Would her father's deed prove valid? Would the land be as valuable as rumored? And what of Roy? Would he remain with her once his duty as protector was fulfilled? Or would he continue on his own path, leaving her to face her new life alone? With these questions swirling in her mind, Katherine drifted into sleep. The distant sounds of the city, a strange lullaby to ears accustomed to the quiet of the Kansas countryside. Morning came with golden light streaming through the hotel window, and the sounds of Denver awakening outside. Katherine rose early, dressing carefully in her best outfit for their visit to the land office. As she pinned her hair, she heard Roy moving about in the adjacent room, the sounds oddly domestic and reassuring. When he knocked on the connecting door, she called for him to enter. Roy appeared, freshly shaved and dressed in a clean shirt and waistcoat, his usual trail-worn appearance transformed into something more befitting a business meeting in the city. "You look different," Katherine observed, a small smile playing at her lips. "Better or worse?" Roy asked, returning her smile. "Just different," she replied, though in truth she found him handsome either way. "Ready for our appointment, as ready as we can be," Roy said. "I've ordered breakfast to be sent up. Once we've eaten, we'll head to the land office." Over breakfast, they discussed their approach. Katherine would present her father's deed and explain her inheritance of the property. Roy would accompany her as, what, friend, protector. The ambiguity of their relationship remained unresolved, but for the purposes of their business at the land office, they decided that business associate would suffice. The Denver land office was located in a solid stone building near the center of the city. Inside, clerks worked at high desks while citizens waited on wooden benches for their turn to present their claims, disputes, or inquiries. Katherine approached the main desk, Roy at her side, and stated her purpose to the clerk, a middle-aged man with ink-stained fingers and a perpetually furrowed brow. "Mitchell land claim, you say?" The clerk shuffled through a stack of ledgers. "When was the original deed issued?" 1851, Katherine replied, presenting the document. "To Daniel Mitchell, my father." The clerk examined the deed, his expression neutral. "And you're claiming inheritance?" "Yes, my father passed recently. I'm his only child and heir." "Do you have documentation of his death and your relationship?" Katherine hesitated. She had left Kansas with nothing but the deed and locket, fleeing for her life with no thought to legal documentation. "My father was murdered just days ago," she explained, her voice steady despite the pain the words caused. "I had to leave our home in Kansas rather precipitously." The sheriff in Hays City, Thomas Miller, was investigating the murder. "He should be able to confirm my story." The clerk's expression softened slightly. "I see. That's unfortunate. However, without proper documentation of inheritance, I cannot immediately record the transfer of the deed to your name." Roy stepped forward. Sheriff Miller was sending a telegram to the Denver authorities explaining the situation. "Has that communication been received?" The clerk frowned. "I wouldn't necessarily be aware of such correspondence. You would need to speak with the land commissioner, Mr. Abernathy." He gestured to a closed door at the back of the office. "He's in a meeting at present but should be available within the hour." Katherine felt a mix of disappointment and worry. Every delay increased the risk that Sloan might catch up to them. "We'll wait," Roy decided, guiding Katherine to one of the benches. "It's important to get this resolved properly." As they waited, Katherine found herself studying the other people in the office, a weathered farmer arguing over boundary lines, a well-dressed businessman discussing a commercial property, a young couple excitedly filing a homestead claim. All of them with dreams and plans tied to the land, just as her father had once dreamed. Finally, the door to the commissioner's office opened, and a portly gentleman in a fine suit emerged, showing out a visitor. The clerk approached him, spoke briefly, and then gestured for Katherine and Roy to come forward. "Mr. Abernathy will see you now," the clerk announced. The land commissioner's office was well appointed, with a large oak desk, bookshelves lined with legal volumes, and maps of Colorado territory covering the walls. Mr. Abernathy himself was a man in his 50s with graying mutton chop whiskers and keen eyes that assessed Katherine and Roy with professional interest. "Miss Mitchell, is it?" he said after they had introduced themselves. "My clerk tells me you're claiming inheritance of a land parcel without the standard documentation." "Yes, sir," Katherine confirmed, once again explaining the circumstances of her father's death and her hasty departure from Kansas. Mr. Abernathy listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. When she had finished, he said, "As it happens, Miss Mitchell, I did receive a telegram from Sheriff Miller of Hays City yesterday evening. He corroborated your account and requested that we extend every courtesy while the formal documentation is being prepared." Relief washed over Katherine. "Then you'll record the transfer of the deed?" "Provisionally, yes," Mr. Abernathy agreed. "Pending receipt of the official death certificate and probate documents, which Sheriff Miller assured me are being processed." He examined the deed Katherine had presented. "This appears to be in order. Your father purchased this land from the original territorial grant holder in 1851. "Can you tell us exactly where the property is located?" Roy asked. "The description in the deed is somewhat vague by modern standards." Mr. Abernathy rose and moved to one of the wall maps. "Let me see, Mitchell. Yes, here it is. The property is located approximately 15 miles northwest of Denver, near the foothills, 160 acres, including a section of Clear Creek." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Interesting location." "Why is that, sir?" Katherine asked, moving closer to examine the map. "Clear Creek has yielded significant gold and silver deposits over the years," the commissioner explained. "Though much of it has been claimed, new strikes are still being made. Your father's land includes both creek access and higher ground suitable for grazing or agriculture. Quite versatile." Katherine's heart quickened. The rumors about silver might indeed have substance. "Has anyone attempted to claim this land or dispute my father's ownership?" Mr. Abernathy consulted a ledger on his desk. "There have been inquiries over the years, certainly. Land of this type attracts interest. But your father's title has remained clear. He paid his taxes promptly, which maintained his claim despite his absence." "And now," Roy asked, "once the deed is transferred to Miss Mitchell, the land is hers to use or dispose of as she sees fit," the commissioner confirmed. "Though I would advise having a proper survey conducted before making any significant decisions. Boundaries that were established 27 years ago might need clarification." "How would we arrange for such a survey?" Katherine asked. "My office can provide a list of reputable surveyors," Mr. Abernathy offered. "And while we're completing the provisional transfer, I can have my clerk prepare that information for you." By noon, Katherine had signed the necessary paperwork for the provisional transfer of the deed to her name, received a certified copy of the updated documentation, and obtained a detailed map showing the location of her property, along with a list of recommended surveyors. "That went better than I expected," she admitted to Roy as they left the land office, "though it still doesn't feel entirely real." "It will once we see the land," Roy suggested. "We could hire a carriage tomorrow, make the journey out to the property." "I'd like that," Katherine agreed. The prospect of finally seeing the land her father had purchased, the legacy he had left her, filled her with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. What would she find there? And what would she do with it afterward? As they walked back toward the hotel, Katherine became aware of Roy's increased vigilance, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "You see something?" she asked quietly, her own senses heightening in response to his tension. "Not exactly," Roy murmured. "Just a feeling." "We're being watched." Katherine resisted the urge to look around wildly, instead maintaining her pace beside Roy. "Sloane, possibly, or it could be nothing." Roy guided her around a corner, his hand lightly touching her elbow. "Let's take a different route back, just to be safe." They wound through several side streets, Roy occasionally changing direction without warning. Katherine followed his lead, trusting his instincts even as her anxiety grew. Finally, they emerged onto a busier thoroughfare near the hotel. "I think we're clear," Roy said, though his posture remained alert. "But we should minimize our time in public until we're ready to visit the property." Back in the safety of the hotel, Katherine sank onto a chair in her room, the tension of the morning catching up with her. "Do you really think Sloane has followed us to Denver?" Roy frowned, standing by the window where he could observe the street below without being easily seen. "I don't know, but I've learned it's better to assume the worst and be pleasantly surprised than the alternative." "What do we do now?" Katherine asked. "We continue with our plans," Roy said firmly. "Tomorrow we visit your property. Tonight we stay in, have dinner sent up again." He paused, then added, "I might also make a few inquiries around town, see if there are any strangers asking questions about newcomers from Kansas." "You can't go alone," Katherine protested. "If Sloane is here, I'll be careful," Roy assured her. "And you'll be safer here with the hotel staff nearby and the door locked. I won't be gone long." Katherine wanted to argue further, but she recognized the logic of his plan. If Sloane was in Denver, they needed to know. And Roy, with his experience and training, was better equipped to gather such information discreetly than she was. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said finally. "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me." Roy's expression softened. "I promise." He hesitated, then added, "Katherine, no matter what happens, I want you to know that meeting you, helping you, it's given me a purpose I haven't felt in a long time." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "Roy," a knock at the outer door interrupted whatever she had been about to say. They exchanged a glance, Roy's hand moving to his gun as he approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" he called. "Telegram for Miss Mitchell," came the reply. Roy gestured for Katherine to stay back as he opened the door just enough to see a uniformed hotel employee holding a yellow envelope. After ensuring there was no one else in the hallway, Roy accepted the telegram and tipped the messenger before closing and locking the door again. "It's from Sheriff Miller," Katherine said, reading the telegram Roy handed her. "He says they've apprehended 2 of Sloane's men back in Hays City. They've confessed to the murder and implicated Sloane as the ringleader. There's a warrant out for his arrest now." "That's good news," Roy said, though his expression remained cautious. "But it also means Sloane has nothing left to lose. If he knows he's wanted for murder, he'll be even more desperate to get what he came for." Katherine refolded the telegram, her momentary relief fading. "The deed and the map." "Exactly. But now we have confirmation that the law is on our side. If Sloane shows himself in Denver, we can have him arrested immediately." "If we can find a lawman in time," Katherine pointed out. Roy nodded grimly. "Which is why we need to remain cautious until we're certain he's no longer a threat." The rest of the day passed quietly, with meals delivered to their rooms, and most of their time spent planning their visit to the property the next day. Roy did go out briefly in the late afternoon, visiting several saloons and hotels to discreetly inquire about newcomers matching Sloane's description. He returned with mixed news. No one matching Sloane's exact description has been noticed, but there have been several strangers asking about a young woman and man recently arrived from Kansas. Could be coincidence, but probably not, Katherine finished, her stomach tightening with anxiety. So he is here. Likely, Roy agreed. But Denver is a big city, and we have the advantage of knowing he's looking for us. Tomorrow we'll hire a private carriage rather than taking the regular stagecoach to the mining areas. Less predictable that way. They retired early that night, both needing rest for the journey ahead. As Katherine prepared for bed, she found herself thinking of Roy in the next room, so close yet separated by more than just a door. In the few days they had known each other, he had become essential to her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. The thought of eventually continuing without him, once her land claim was secure and Sloane no longer a threat, left an emptiness in her chest she didn't want to examine too closely. Morning brought clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect for their expedition to the property. Roy had arranged for a private carriage and driver through the hotel, specifying a man who knew the area well and could help them locate the boundaries of Katherine's land. As they set out from Denver, the city gradually giving way to more open country, Katherine felt a growing excitement despite the lingering concerns about Sloane. This land, this journey, represented her future whatever it might hold. The driver, an older man named Jenkins who had been in Colorado since the first gold rush, proved knowledgeable about the region. Mitchell land, you say? That would be the old parcel along Clear Creek with the stand of pines on the north ridge. Been vacant as long as I can recall, though the taxes must have been paid or it would have been auctioned off years ago. My father maintained ownership from afar, Katherine explained. He always intended to return someday. Jenkins nodded sagely. Lot of folks come west with dreams that don't quite work out as planned. No shame in that. As they traveled, the landscape changed, the rolling plains giving way to more rugged terrain as they approached the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. The air grew cooler, fresher, scented with pine and sage. Katherine found herself enchanted by the wild beauty of it, so different from the Kansas farmland she had known all her life. There, Jenkins said finally, pointing toward a creek valley nestled between tree-covered ridges. That's Clear Creek, and if I'm not mistaken, your property starts just beyond that bend where the water widens. Katherine leaned forward eagerly as the carriage followed a rough track down toward the creek. The valley opened up before them, revealing a breathtaking vista, the clear, rushing water of the creek cutting through a meadow bordered by stands of pine and aspen, the trees just beginning to show the gold of autumn. In the distance, the foothills rose toward the majestic peaks of the Rockies, still snow-capped even in October. It's beautiful, she whispered, unable to take her eyes from the scene. Roy, seated beside her, was similarly impressed. Your father chose well, he said softly. This is fine land. Jenkins brought the carriage to a stop near the creek bank. This is about the center of the property, as I recall. 160 acres means it extends roughly a quarter-mile in each direction from here. As they disembarked, Katherine tried to absorb the reality that this land, this beautiful, wild place, was now hers. She walked to the edge of the creek, watching the water tumble over rocks, clear and cold from the mountain snowmelt. Gold was first discovered in this creek back in '59, Jenkins informed them, coming to stand nearby. Started the rush that built Denver. Most of the easy pickings are long gone, but folks still find color now and then. And silver? Roy asked, exchanging a glance with Katherine. Some, Jenkins acknowledged. More in the hills than the creek itself. There's been talk of veins running through this area, though no one's hit anything substantial in recent years. Katherine knelt by the creek, trailing her fingers through the cold water. Whether or not there was silver beneath the soil, this land had value beyond mineral wealth. She could envision a home here, a life built in this beautiful valley. They spent the next few hours exploring the property, Jenkins pointing out the likely boundaries based on natural landmarks. There was no structure on the land, not even the remnants of a cabin or mining shack, suggesting that her father had purchased it as an investment rather than ever attempting to work it himself. "What do you think?" Roy asked quietly as they stood on a small rise overlooking the meadow. Jenkins had walked ahead, examining something of interest near a stand of aspens. "I think I could be happy here," Katherine replied honestly. "It's nothing like what I expected, but I can see the potential." Roy nodded, his gaze taking in the landscape. "It would make a good ranch," he observed. "The meadow for grazing, the creek for water, timber on the ridges for building. Even if there's no silver, it's valuable land." "You sound like you've thought about this kind of place before," Katherine said, studying his face. "Similar to what I've been looking for," Roy admitted. "Though I hadn't expected to find it quite like this." There was something in his tone, a hint of what remained unsaid, that made Katherine's heart beat faster. Before she could respond, Jenkins called out to them, "Folks, you might want to see this." They hurried to where the driver was standing near the base of a rocky outcropping partially hidden by trees. As they approached, Jenkins pointed to a dark opening in the rock face, a small cave, or perhaps the entrance to a mine shaft. "This looks like someone started a mining operation at some point," Jenkins said. "Not recent work. The timber supporting the entrance is old, weathered." Roy examined the opening cautiously. "Could my father have done this?" Katherine wondered aloud, "before he left for Kansas?" "Possible," Jenkins allowed. "The work looks to be 25 years old. Right timing." Roy disappeared into the opening briefly, then emerged with a troubled expression. "The shaft extends quite a way in," he reported. "Would need proper equipment to explore safely." "But there's evidence of work, old pick marks, the remains of a cart track." "So my father was mining here," Katherine said, the realization both surprising and somehow fitting. "He never mentioned it, but—" "Lot of men came west, tried their luck in the mines, then moved on without much to show for it," Jenkins commented. "No shame in it. More failed than succeeded in the gold fields." Roy and Katherine exchanged a meaningful look. If her father had started mining here and found nothing, why had he maintained ownership of the land all these years? And why had Sloan and his men been so convinced there was something valuable worth killing for? As the afternoon wore on, they continued exploring, finding no other signs of development or mining activity. Jenkins suggested they start back to Denver before darkness fell, as the trail could be treacherous at night. "We can return with proper surveying equipment," Roy assured Katherine as they reluctantly turned back toward the carriage. "And perhaps someone who knows mining to examine that shaft safely." Katherine nodded, taking one last look at her valley now. Despite the questions that remained, she felt a connection to this place, a sense that her father had left her not just land but a future full of possibilities. They were nearly back to the carriage when the shot rang out, the bullet splintering the bark of a tree just inches from Katherine's head. Roy reacted instantly, shoving her to the ground and drawing his own gun in one fluid motion. "Get to cover," he shouted, pulling her toward the shelter of a large boulder as a second shot kicked up dirt at their feet. Jenkins had already taken refuge behind the carriage, his own revolver drawn. "Where are they?" he called. "Ridge to the north," Roy replied, his eyes scanning the tree line above them. "At least one shooter." Katherine's heart pounded in her chest as she pressed herself against the boulder. After coming so far, after finally seeing her inheritance, to have Sloane find them here seemed a cruel twist of fate. "It's Sloane," she whispered to Roy. "It has to be." "Probably," Roy agreed grimly. "He must have followed us from Denver. What do we do now?" Katherine asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite her fear. Roy's expression was determined. "We end this." He raised his voice, calling out toward the ridge. "Sloane, we know it's you. The game's over. There's a warrant out for your arrest in Kansas. Murder charges. You're finished either way." There was a moment of silence, then a voice called back. "All I want is what's mine, Mitchell. The deed and the map. Hand them over and you can walk away." "There's 3 of us and only 1 of you," Roy shouted back. "You're outnumbered and outgunned." Laughter drifted down from the ridge. "You sure about that, Hawkins?" A chill ran through Katherine at the implication. "How many of Sloane's men were out there, Miss Mitchell?" Jenkins hissed from his position behind the carriage. "When I give the signal, make for the carriage. I'll cover you." Before Katherine could respond, Roy's grip on her arm tightened. "No," he said firmly. "Too exposed. We stay together." Another shot rang out, this one striking the boulder they were sheltering behind. Katherine flinched at the impact. "They're trying to pin us down until dark," Roy murmured. "Once night falls, they'll have the advantage." Katherine's hand went to her pocket, where the deed and her mother's locket with its map were secured. "Maybe we should give them what they want," she suggested reluctantly. "It's not worth dying for." Roy's eyes met hers, intense and unwavering. "It's your future," he said. "And it's about more than the deed now. Sloane's a murderer. He killed your father. If we give him what he wants, he still can't let us walk away to testify against him." The truth of his words sank in. This confrontation could only end one way, with either Sloane or themselves prevailing. "I need to draw their fire," Roy said, his mind clearly racing through options. "Find out how many there are and where they're positioned." "Jenkins," he called softly to the driver, "can you make it to those trees to the east if we provide covering fire?" The older man assessed the distance. "Reckon so if you keep their heads down." "On my signal then," Roy instructed. "Katherine, stay here. Don't move until I get back." "Get back." "Where are you going?" Alarm filled her as she realized he was planning something dangerous. "Trust me," Roy said, his expression softening briefly as he looked at her. "I won't let anything happen to you, not after everything we've been through." Before she could protest further, Roy gave Jenkins the signal. Both men fired toward the ridge, their shots striking trees and rocks where they suspected the attackers might be hiding. In the commotion, Jenkins darted for the trees, making it safely while return fire focused on the boulder where Roy and Katherine sheltered. Then, to Katherine's horror, Roy suddenly broke cover in the opposite direction, running in a zigzag pattern toward a cluster of rocks that would give him a different angle on the ridge. Shots followed him, kicking up dirt at his heels, but he reached the new position unharmed. Katherine held her breath, watching as Roy and Jenkins continued to exchange fire with the hidden attackers, gradually forcing them to reveal their positions. She counted at least 3 different locations where muzzle flashes appeared on the ridge. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as the gunfight continued. The sun was sinking toward the western mountains, shadows lengthening across the valley. Soon, darkness would give Sloane the advantage he needed. Then, unexpectedly, a new sound joined the gunfire, hoofbeats approaching rapidly from the direction of the main trail. Katherine peered cautiously around the boulder and saw riders coming, 5 men wearing the badges of the Denver Sheriff's Department. Relief washed over her as she realized what had happened. Roy must have arranged for law enforcement to follow them discreetly, anticipating that Sloane might make his move when they visited the property. The arrival of the lawmen changed the dynamics instantly. Outnumbered and facing official opposition, Sloan and his men began to retreat up the ridge, firing sporadically to cover their withdrawal. "Miss Mitchell," one of the deputies called, "stay down until we secure the area." Katherine complied, watching anxiously as the deputies dismounted and began to advance up the ridge in pursuit of Sloan. Roy emerged from his position, moving quickly to Katherine's side. "Are you all right?" he asked, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "I'm fine," she assured him. "But how?" "I spoke with the Denver sheriff last night," Roy explained. "Told him everything about Sloan and arranged for deputies to follow us at a distance today. I suspected Sloan might make his move when we were away from the city." "You didn't tell me," Katherine said, a mixture of relief and mild reproach in her voice. "I didn't want to worry you unnecessarily," Roy admitted. "And if Sloan was watching us, any change in our behavior might have alerted him." Before Katherine could respond, gunfire erupted again from higher on the ridge. The deputies had engaged Sloan and his men. The exchange was brief but intense, followed by shouts and then an eerie silence. Minutes later, one of the deputies appeared at the top of the ridge, waving his hat to signal the all clear. "We got him," he called down. "Two in custody, one dead, Sloan," Roy shouted back. "The one with the pockmarked face, he's alive. Wounded, but he'll stand trial." The tension that had held Katherine rigid for so long finally released, leaving her trembling with the aftermath of fear and relief. It was over. Truly over. Sloan would face justice for her father's murder, and her land was secure. Roy's arm went around her shoulders, steadying her. "It's done," he said softly. "You're safe now." Katherine looked up at him, seeing the same relief in his eyes, but also something more, a warmth, a tenderness that made her breath catch. Without thinking, she reached up, her hand touching his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." For a moment they stood there, the unspoken feelings between them hovering on the edge of acknowledgement. Then Jenkins approached, breaking the spell. "Quite an adventure," the driver commented, seemingly unfazed by the gunfight he had participated in. "Reckon we should head back to Denver now that the excitement's over." Katherine reluctantly stepped back from Roy, though his hand remained at the small of her back as they walked to the carriage. The deputies would handle Sloan and his captured men, bringing them back to Denver to face charges. As they began the journey back to the city, the sun setting behind the mountains in a blaze of orange and gold, Katherine found herself thinking not of the danger they had escaped, but of the future that now lay open before her. The land was hers, free and clear. Sloan was no longer a threat. For the first time since her father's murder, she could look forward rather than constantly glancing over her shoulder. And Roy? What of Roy Hawkins? He had fulfilled his promise to see her safely to Denver and secure her inheritance. Would he now continue on his own path, seeking that fresh start he had spoken of? The thought brought an ache to her heart that surprised her with its intensity. They reached Denver after nightfall, the city lights a welcome sight after the tensions of the day. The hotel seemed particularly welcoming, its lobby warm and well lit compared to the darkness outside. "I should report to the sheriff," Roy said as they entered the hotel. "Make sure all the details about Sloan are properly recorded." "Of course," Katherine agreed, suddenly uncertain. Now that the immediate danger was past, the parameters of their relationship seemed equally unclear. "I'll wait for you." Roy's eyes met hers, a question in them. "If you'd like," he said carefully. "There are things we should discuss." Katherine nodded, her heart beating faster at his tone. "I'll be in my room." The hour Roy was gone seemed interminable. Katherine paced her hotel room, her mind replaying not just the events of the day, but the entire journey that had brought them to this point. From that first moment in the Kansas woods when Roy had said, "Get behind me and stay there," to this evening standoff at her property, he had been her constant protector, her ally, her what? Friend. Something more. A knock at the connecting door startled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, suddenly nervous. Roy entered, looking weary but relieved. "It's confirmed," he said. "Sloan is in custody along with one of his men. The third man, the one who was killed, was the thin fellow from the train. The Denver sheriff will coordinate with Sheriff Miller in Hays City to ensure Sloan faces charges for your father's murder." "That's good," Katherine said, distracted by the intensity of Roy's gaze. "And the land? Secure. The deputies confirmed there was no dispute about your claim. The attack today was purely Sloan's desperation." Roy hesitated, then added, "The sheriff mentioned that they found papers on Sloan, old letters and maps suggesting he had been tracking your father for years, convinced he had struck a major silver vein on that property before leaving for Kansas." "Do you think it's true?" Katherine asked. "The silver, I mean." "The mine entrance we found suggests your father was prospecting there," Roy acknowledged. "Whether he found anything valuable, that would require proper exploration, but regardless, the land itself is valuable." Katherine nodded, absently touching the locket around her neck. "So what happens now?" she asked quietly. Roy took a step closer. "That depends," he said, his voice low. "On what you want, Katherine." The use of her first name, the warmth in his tone, made her heart skip. "What I want?" She echoed. "The land is yours," Roy said. "You could sell it, take the money, and return to Kansas, or stay in Denver perhaps, buy a house in the city." He paused. "Or you could develop the property, build a home there, see if there really is silver beneath the soil." Katherine studied his face, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. "And you?" she asked softly. "What will you do now that your duty as my protector is fulfilled?" Roy's expression softened. "My duty, as you call it, was fulfilled the moment we reached Hays City," he admitted. "Everything since then has been by choice." "Why?" Katherine asked, needing to hear him say it. Roy took another step toward her, close enough now that she could feel the warmth of him. "Because in the span of a few days you became important to me," he said simply. "More important than I expected, than I thought possible." Katherine's breath caught. "Roy, I told you I was looking for a fresh start in Colorado," he continued. "A chance to build something good, something honest after years of drifting. What I didn't expect was to find someone I wanted to build it with." His words hung in the air between them, a declaration and a question all at once. Katherine felt tears spring to her eyes, not of sadness, but of a joy so unexpected it overwhelmed her. "I was so afraid," she whispered, "that once the danger was past, you would continue on your way. That all of this what's grown between us was just circumstance and proximity." Roy's hand came up to cup her cheek, gentle despite the calluses earned from years of hard work. "It's more than that," he said softly. "Much more." Katherine leaned into his touch. "I feel it too," she admitted. "This connection between us, I've never experienced anything like it." "I know it's fast," Roy acknowledged. "We've known each other barely a week. But sometimes life gives you chances you didn't expect, and you have to be brave enough to take them." "Like running into the woods to escape 5 men," Katherine said with a small smile, "and finding a cowboy instead." "Like seeing a woman in danger and deciding her battle was worth fighting," Roy returned. His expression grew serious again. "Katherine, I'm not a perfect man. I've made mistakes, done things I'm not proud of, but meeting you, helping you, it's given me a chance to be the man I want to be. And if you'll let me, I'd like to stay by your side. Not as a protector, but as a partner." Katherine's heart felt too full for her chest. In the space of a week, she had lost her father, her home, everything familiar, and found something she hadn't known she was looking for. A connection that felt deeper, more real than anything she had experienced before. "I'd like that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Very much." The distance between them vanished as Roy drew her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was gentle yet filled with promise. Catherine's arms wound around his neck, her body molding against his as if they had been designed to fit together. When they finally parted, both breathless, Roy rested his forehead against hers. "So, Miss Mitchell," he said with a smile in his voice, "what shall we do with our land?" The hour warmed her more than any declaration could have. "Build a home," she replied without hesitation. "Perhaps a ranch, as you suggested. And yes, explore the mine, see if my father's silver is real or just a dream." "Dreams have their place," Roy said, his arms still around her waist. "They bring us to where we're meant to be." As the October night deepened outside their window, Katherine and Roy began to plan their future, a home in the valley by Clear Creek, a ranch that would grow over time, perhaps children someday to fill the rooms with laughter. And if there was silver beneath the soil, it would be a welcome addition to the riches they had already found in each other. In the spring of 1879, just 6 months after their first meeting in the Kansas woods, Katherine Mitchell became Katherine Hawkins in a small ceremony beside Clear Creek. The ranch house was still under construction, a solid structure of pine logs with a stone fireplace and windows that framed the mountain views perfectly. Wedding guests included Sheriff Miller from Hays City, who had traveled to witness the union of the woman he had helped protect, and the man who had once passed through his town with a shadowed past. The mine did indeed yield silver, though not the mother lode Sloan had imagined. It provided enough to ensure the ranch's success through the lean early years, allowing Roy and Katherine to build not just a home but a future together. And on cool autumn evenings, they would often sit on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, and remind each other of how it all began with 5 men pursuing through the woods, and a cowboy who had said, "Get behind me and stay there." But Katherine had done more than stay behind Roy Hawkins. She had walked beside him into a life neither of them had imagined possible, finding in each other the home they had both been seeking all along.